My Ko-Fi supporters see my videos early. Support me using the link in the description or on my channel. For anyone who hasn't seen the last video, I'd recommend you go do that first, as recapping what led up to this point would probably take 10 minutes on its own. Everyone else, enjoy. I don't think it's a surprise that feeding the barrels for chemical science from a bot mall had no chance to ever keep up. So my first order of business is to actually set up a belted production line for barrels. The process of creating a barrel is a lot more involved than in vanilla. Taking a tier 1 tank, then upgrading it into a tier 2 tank, which is split into 2 smaller tanks that are individually combined with a valve to make 5 barrels. A single assembler will do, as the throughput is quite good. All the difficulty is in the myriad of different materials being brought together. Power is omnipresently a problem, so I turned this entire fumarole field into a power plant. Despite its obscene material cost, it feels quite cheap to get power so easily, though it does free up some brain space for the more complex chemistry related aspects of the mod. Despite the many hours I put into the train base over to the east, my first major choice of this episode is to just give up on it and start over elsewhere. To this end, I start to lay out an area using some stone bricks over to the west, which is where I'm going to start my new, and much more structured, hopefully, base. It consists of 2 columns. The smaller on the right is where the solids bus will go, and the larger on the left is where the fluid bus will go. And then the base will be built on either side, making use of the buses to hopefully greatly simplify the entire process. The train base, in the meantime, is a massive waste of UPS and power. So by fiddling with this train signal at the depots, I stop all the trains, which will slowly and eventually kill the whole thing. I could, and perhaps should, deconstruct it, but at this point technical terminology coming up here, could not in a million years be asked. Since aluminum and the new iron ingot free recipe both require caustic solution, I think it's safe to say it is the lifeline of a base, and it's what I'm going to be starting with. This little box is 1 by 3 chunks in size, which leaves us enough room to expand later if caustic demand spikes. To produce caustic solution, we're going to be separating saline water into brine and water, and electrolysing both, which will give us our precious sodium hydroxide, as well as supplemental supplies of hydrogen, oxygen and chlorine. Naturally, if we're producing caustic solution, we're also producing too much chlorine, so my next step is to see that our caustic solution is never limited by an excess of chlorine, using the mineral dust voiding process. I set up a little area near the lake here and work backwards from the end of the process, starting with voiding the sludge. Then I need to set up the mineral dust dissolving, which is where the chlorine is actually destroyed. It is worth noting that this setup is entirely to void excess chlorine. I'll build a separate setup for destroying the excess gravel and stone produced by the rest of the factory later. I then need to set up the whole limestone to mineral dust line, although I did wish I gave myself some more space, as I needed to get creative to fit it all in. With the limestone finally plugged in, that's our chlorine voiding needs satiated for the moment. Next up is the air separation build, and for it I've just copied the old one from the starter base, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Finally, it's time to make use of a newly unlocked process, being methane pyrolysis to create graphite. The recipe itself couldn't be easier, taking just methane and turning it into graphite and hydrogen. The problem came in my method of creating the methane, for which I made what I thought was a safe assumption that more complex recipe equals more efficient. What I ended up doing was creating ethylene, propene and benzene from alkene synthesis, and then using the ethylene and propene pyrolysis recipes to just turn it all into methane and benzene. This is a lot more complicated than it needed to be, and I will later replace this behemoth with the simple methane recipe we haven't used since the very start of the game. The meagre hydrogen and oxygen produced by the caustic solution setup will not be sufficient going forward, and indeed can't keep up with this graphite setup alone, so it's time to get around to some pure water electrolysis. The next course of action is iron production, for which I'm using the new iron ingot free recipe. It's a lot closer to aluminium ingot production, and I would love to walk you through it from the start, but I chose to build it from the end, so we're going to have to go at it a funny way. The final step is to smelt iron oxide, graphite, and crushed limestone in a furnace, which gives the ingots, gravel, and lime, as well as a bit of carbon dioxide. That gravel just gets fucked off to be melted elsewhere, but we can turn the lime back into limestone, which recovers half the cost, which you can see me doing here. We supplement the other half by crushing some more limestone we're bringing in. The graphite also obviously just comes from the bus, leaving the only last ingredient, iron oxide. You're going to understand my comparison to aluminum ingot processing now. As to get it, we're crushing iron ore and then feeding the crush into flotation plants with caustic solution to make iron oxide, as well as sludge, which we're avoiding in the usual way. Here's the thing in action anyway. It produces a yellow belt of iron, but the red belt is there, because when combined with all the byproducts, it obviously fills up more than a yellow belt on the way out. With our material processing bringing so much gravel into existence, we need to start working on ways to bring it back out of existence. So it's time for another industrially sized mineral dust toilet. I just built one of these a minute ago, so I won't dwell on it too much. Remember that mineral research recipe I mentioned, which I said was too complicated to be worth it? Well, my science target in this new base is going to be 120 per minute, so the better recipes are non-negotiable. Thankfully, it's actually a lot less complicated than I initially suspected, for reasons I will explain. You see, 3 of the 5 ingredients are crushed bauxite, sand and crushed iron, all of which are created in the bauxite crushing process. And even better, the other 2 ingredients are crushed limestone and mineral dust, both of which can be created from crushing down limestone. All of this is to say that despite this being the complicated and therefore better recipe, this isn't really that complicated at all. Continuing through our list of materials we need to create to catch up with the old base, next up is aluminium. It is a new recipe, but you'll find it's very familiar, as most of the steps are the same as the old one, up until how we deal with aluminum carbide, where instead of turning it back into aluminum hydroxide, we instead combine it with more alumina to make a lot of aluminum ingots and some carbon monoxide. Something you'll notice is that the build only takes up half of the little box I built for it, and this only outputs half a belt of aluminum ingots. So if we need to upgrade to a full belt, it's as simple as just copying another one of these into the empty space. Of course, as with a lot of things in this mod, it's not all that simple, as the bauxite crushing actually creates extra crushed iron and sand, which we could probably incorporate into iron ingot and silicon production respectively, but which we instead are just going to void. Crushed iron can just be crushed further into gravel, which we slip into the existing voiding infrastructure, and sand can be combined with seawater to make wastewater, which we simply flush away. It can be tempting in this mod to make the absolute most out of every single byproduct, but if you're willing to bite the bullet and get rid of some of them, you might just save yourself some time and sanity. The catalyst for the mess I'm about to formulate was the realisation that both plastic and rubber share a lot of the same ingredients, and I kind of want a belt of both, which is pushing me to the limits of this little space I'm giving myself. The first step is alkene synthesis, which, as we've seen before, turns hydrogen and carbon monoxide into ethylene, propene and benzene. To balance ethylene and propene, we use ethylene or propene pyrolysis, and when we have too much of one, we pass it into the pyrolysis setup, which turns it into benzene, methane and the other out of the 2 chemicals. This leaves us with a lot of unused benzene and methane, but we'll get around to fixing that later on. Now, I paused here, and then, upon returning, forgot to unpause OBS, meaning it looks like all of this shit spawned into existence out of nowhere, so I'll try to catch you up. We make styrene and butadiene, just like in the old rubber build, and then create ammonia using compressed hydrogen and nitrogen. We are also burning off excess benzene and just venting any excess methane into the air. Next up, we're combining propene, oxygen and ammonia to create acrylonitrile, an ingredient in the new rubber recipe. Propene, oxygen and benzene can then be combined to make BPA, this time an ingredient for plastic. Putting together the acrylonitrile, butadiene, styrene and BPA, we get polycarbonate and acrylonitrile butadiene styrene blend, or PC/ABS, which is our new and very efficient plastic recipe. I should make it clear that even though I use the fancy names for full effect, in the context of the game, it's all the same plastic bars. You'll notice that to route the butadiene over to the plastic, I went outside of the little box I gave myself, and this is something which I'm sorry to say will only get more common as the base continues. Now, the rubber takes acrylonitrile, as well as butadiene, and a new chemical we're going to need to make called solvent. Solvent is going to be used a lot later, but for now, a single assembler is enough to feed this build, and to make it, we need to combine oxygen, carbon monoxide, and methanol, which we can make from that methane byproduct. Once the rubber production begins, I realised that I was one assembler short of a full yellow belt of product, so I have to tack it on the end here. Now that I'm actually producing enough wastewater, I shot together a quick 120 signs per minute of climate research, which is easy with the improved recipe. I'm pulling all the sciences I build down here, since this is where I will eventually put all of my labs when I get to that point. Naturally, our next science is mechanical engineering research. However, unlike the last two, we still have to use this shitty first recipe, which leads to the assemblers for the packs themselves alone being this big. At some point, I unlocked more efficient recipes for iron components for the small price of a bit of hydrochloric acid, and I considered for a moment not using it to save the hassle. However, I would then have to build more iron production, so my better judgment took precedent, and I went with the better recipes. I ended up expanding iron production anyway, however, since it's going to be used for more sciences further down the line, as well as the mega mall I was planning to build at the end of the base. More on that later. Back at the mechanical research build, there are actually improved recipes for iron wire and sheets involving lubricant, but this time, the desire to not have to build a lubricant overpowered the bit of my brain which said everything must be as efficient as possible. So I ended up just using the old recipes. But anyway, there's not much more of interest to this build, so I finished it and promptly moved on. I again paused the game, but neglect to unpause OBS, so this time a silicon build pops into existence. In the building of this setup, I made the erroneous assumption that more complex always equals better. It's almost like it's becoming a theme in this video, and use a new silica recipe which has negligible efficiency improvements, but gives us rutile as a byproduct. We'll talk more about rutile later, but another mess up I made was forgetting to actually route in the graphite for the silicon, so I have to kind of sneak it in an incredibly ugly way. My next act is to get started on electrical research, not realising I had neglected to produce a vital ingredient. See if you remember what it is. You've seen me build this science before, just on a smaller scale, so I'll skip forward to the moment I realised my mistake. You see, we need glass, and in no small quantity, so the old recipe just won't do it. We unlocked 2 new recipes since the old one, but only the newest one can keep up with the kind of volume we're demanding, and it is quite the list of stuff to start producing it. To start, I built the glass foundries themselves, and I think the number of inserters emptying into each and every building speaks for itself. I had at least the sense to use the old silica recipe, which saved me a lot of strife. The only problem was I am about as far from a lake as you can possibly get, and I need saline water to wash it. Now, instead of bussing it like a wise person, I just run off into the wilderness with underground pipes to hook it up to some random lake. The next, still relatively simple ingredient is lime, created of course just by smelting crushed limestone. By this point I'm struggling to keep the builds within the boundaries I set myself.
Stay in the box, no! Stay in the box, no! Get out of my skin!
If it's cultured to let your neat base descend into a bowl of spaghetti, then I'm going to make a hell of a fucking sourdough. I routed in alumina, which I'm stealing straight out of the middle of the aluminium build, and now all that's left is sodium sulfate and soda ash. The recipe I selected for soda ash has sodium sulfate as an ingredient, so these 2 ingredients are quite intertwined. Before I get too into building it, I make sure that these capacitors can be moved out of the foundries, so I don't accidentally end up locking them in. A fundamental piece of the puzzle I'm missing is sulfur, which is going to require me tapping some volcanic fumaroles and bringing the gas over. I separate it over here, and again I'm just voiding the air since it can quite literally be made out of thin air. Back at the glass setup, I combine the sulfur dioxide with water and oxygen to make sulfuric acid. I also realised I wasn't actually crushing the limestone before I was trying to smelt it, but fortunately this one crusher can handle all the throughput I need for it. Anyway, all sodium sulfate needs is sodium hydroxide and sulfuric acid, and whilst I wait for the sodium hydroxide to make its way here from the caustic solution build, I hook up the output belts to where they need to be, bringing us even closer to getting this glass build online. The only byproduct unaccounted for was calcium chloride, which is a new byproduct we haven't seen before, and which I haven't had time this session to deal with, so I left myself a little note for the next time. And that's precisely what I did when I got back to it, though I did leave this tank of it, as it's actually used in an improved concrete recipe. It's quite a nice byproduct as far as this mod goes, as it can simply be emptied into the water with no extra steps. Before I finish any of that, I had an epiphany about my graphite build, realising that rather than all of this complicated alkene pyrolysis, I could just be making the methane directly from carbon dioxide and hydrogen, so I decided to do that instead. With glass finally on the bus, I can feed it into my electrical research build and finish it at last. Insulated wire was easy, but as it turns out, you need quite a lot more lamp assemblers than I had expected, so any idea of these builds being even vaguely rectangular is thrown out the window, as I expand it out to the side here like a herniated organ. Now with all the electrical research done, it's time to start thinking ahead towards the final of the 5 sciences we had already built, chemical research. Immediately, I know that my little brine electrolysis build will not in a million years keep up with the sodium hydroxide demand from chemical research, so I go to expand it quickly. As with all the other science builds, I start at the end, which gives me a good base for the rest of the build. Since sodium hydroxide and glass are already on the bus, I route them straight in before moving on to our first new ingredient, which is concrete, for which I'm using the better recipe like I mentioned earlier. Concrete, as it turns out, is quite complicated to make, so as much as I'd like to stay in the box, I ultimately have to come out of the box to keep building. Besides the addition of calcium chloride, however, the concrete recipe is largely the same, so we're just going to waltz through it to the next process. Ingredient number 4 is ammonia barrels, for which we're using a new barrel recipe we recently unlocked. It's another one of those improved recipes which are more of a trade-off than an actual upgrade, as although it takes far fewer steps to create, it's actually a bit more expensive than the original recipe, so I'm basically giving up efficiency for some reduced complexity. The ammonia itself is simple, again just combining compressed hydrogen and compressed nitrogen, and we fill up the barrels using this machine called a barrel pump, so all that's left is the 2 fluid ingredients for the science. The 2 being sulfuric acid and a lubricant. Sulfuric acid you just saw me build, so I won't dwell, but lubricant I haven't made in a while, so I'll give you a little reminder. Lubricant takes a combination of methanol, hydrogen chloride and silicon, which spits out lubricant and hydrochloric acid. To deal with the hydrochloric acid, we just plug it into the soda ash setup, where it'll get used up. Chemical research finally starts to produce, meaning this base has almost entirely caught up with the old one. All that's left to do now is build the lab setup itself. I choose the area directly beneath the climate research factory for the labs, as it's not going to be used for much else, and the tangle of belts surrounding it make it unsuitable for any sort of a large setup anyway. For now I just took all the labs from the old base, but I'll get some more built at some point, as this isn't nearly enough for the 120 science per minute we're trying to make. You might remember the rutile I mentioned earlier, which was a byproduct from the silicon build. Well, now we're going to make some use of it. Some of you, if you're a nerd, will know that rutile is better known as titanium dioxide, for which we have a process to turn into pure titanium, also creating a byproduct of salt. As always, we're starting at the end of the process here, where we combine sodium, titanium tetrachloride and argon in a flotation cell, and we're going to work our way back from there. The first ingredient I tackle is argon, which can be found in trace amounts in the planet's atmosphere, so to produce it we're going to need to use a new air separation recipe, which not only gives us the usual carbon dioxide and nitrogen, but also residual gas, which can be further separated into argon, water and trace gas. The water and trace gas we will simply be voiding. Ingredient numero 2 is titanium tetrachloride, which needs rutile, graphite and chlorine. It also produces mineral dust as a byproduct, which I route in a very disgusting way back to the dust sink. For our final ingredient, sodium, we take good old sodium chloride salt out of the sea and zap the chlorine out with it in an electrolyzer. You might remember that salt was an output of titanium production, so we can feed that back around to supplement this production. At this point I had a bit of a wobble in progress, as rather than follow my own advice from last video and properly automate checkpoint objectives, I decided to spend some time hand feeding the next few. Namely, are these batteries, which are very important in a lot of the new recipes, but take such a smorgasbord of random materials I couldn't be bothered to properly automate it. Don't be like me. One ingredient of the batteries is carbon fibre, made by smelting acrylic fibre, which is itself made by combining acrylonitrile, try saying that a couple times in a row, and water. These would have been very beneficial to have automated right now, but alas, mistakes were made that day. By combining caustic solution, chlorine and propene, we make ECH, which if we then combine with solvent and BPA gets us epoxy, an important ingredient in fiberglass, which is another high level material I could have done with properly automating right now rather than jury rigging. The other ingredient in fiberglass is glass fibre, which is made from hard glass. Hard glass is a whole beast of its own, but the most important ingredient is boric acid, which we get from a new volcanic gas separation recipe. The only difference between it and the old one is that it produces boric acid as well as the rest of the ingredients, so it should only really be used when you need some, as it can't be voided. The other checkpoint was for the tier 3 logistics buildings, where I need to build 40 inserter frees and 40 underground belt frees. So I quickly sort that out, and with that I can get back to doing some actual work while research continues in the background. The next science, physics research, is something of a mall check. Basically just requiring a load of tier 2 buildings, which no matter how I wants you to know, you really should be automating. For this reason I'm starting a humongous mall to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. No effort is too great for this mall, as if done well it will greatly expedite my progress going forward. So I'm using all of the improved recipe for iron components, such as hydrochloric acid, for iron rods and plates. I also set up a lubricant for wires and sheets, and then next up I turn the iron into steel, which requires me to belt in some lime for the improved recipe I'm using. The improved steel rod and plate recipes require sulfuric acid rather than hydrochloric, so I get that set up in this little chemical area I have going. Aluminum rods and plates need caustic solution, but once that's all set up, all the major metal components are finished. Still under the illusion that the base will remain relatively neat, I set up this divide between belted production on the left and fully bought mall on the right. Before we get anywhere however, it's time to go back to that aluminum build from earlier and double it up like I said I would. It's easier said than done since there's a bit of a mess where I want to put it, but I can easily clean it up. Despite them only taking up half the square, placing them next to each other is quite an involved process, as alumina and an aluminium carbide both need to be pulled out of the middle to be used in other resources, and this necessitated some alterations to the design to draw equally from both setups. Ultimately it does at least appear to be functional, although it won't run at full pelt quite yet, as we aren't feeding in enough bauxite ore. There are a lot of random materials dotted around the factory that we're going to need in small amounts in the mall, and rather than belt those up to the mall, I'm going to give the whole base Roboport coverage, so I can just drop in and provide a chest at a random material I need. The first item I'm automating in the mall is capacitors, although it probably would have been better to belt automate them, as they're quite important. If I wanted to talk about every single thing in this mall, it'd take me all week. So all I'll say is that I'm generally aiming towards the tier 2 bots which I recently researched, whilst getting some convenient things along the way. Another thing I've recently unlocked is a new chassis, which means an even larger equipment grid size, which for now I have nothing to fill with. A few items I need to automate require alkenes, be it ethylene, propene or benzene, and I realised I didn't actually have a setup anywhere which was putting them onto the fluid bus, so I quickly put one together. Just like in the plastic build, I'm using ethylene and propene pyrolysis to make sure neither back up, then burning off any excess benzene and venting excess methane. The core of a good setup in this mod is making sure that by no means can any byproducts back up. The old volcanic gas separation build was woefully insufficient for the amount of sulfur dioxide I was using, so I decided to build a new one. There are 2 volcanic gas separation recipes, both of which give the same amount of the same gases per unit of volcanic gas, but one giving us boric acid as well. Since boric acid can't be voided, the general idea is to just use the one that produces it until we have enough, and when we have too much, use the other recipe. I even added a circuit to dump sulfur dioxide while the boric acid wasn't full, although I think I expected to use far more than I actually ended up using. I also finally got around to automating solvent and epoxy with this quirky little build. The most important new thing I was producing, however, was circuits, which are used for higher tier modules and the next science pack. Anyway, with boric acid and epoxy, we are very close to fully automated fiberglass, so that's what I'm going to go for next. I start with a silica build, slightly overbuilding it because I figured I could just empty any extra into the logistics network to be used in the mall. Combining silica, boric acid, alumina and lime, we get hard glass, and we can then pass the hard glass into a foundry with water to make glass fibre. Combining epoxy and glass fibre gets us fiberglass, which, similar to circuits, is required in the next science, as well as just overall being quite useful. I get started on tier 2 bots finally here. When a tier 2 logistic bot is placed into the robot replacer requester chest, an idle tier 1 logistic bot will fly over and change places with it, meaning that over time, all of the old logistics bots will be emptied out of the system. This is especially convenient because the tier 2 bots take a tier 1 bot as part of the recipe, so the collected bot can be used to craft another tier 2 bot. In the background, I had copy pasted another of these massive air separation builds, but neglected to retrofit it for the new air separation recipe, since we're going to start to need a lot of argon soon, so I decided to just build an entire new one right next to it. I explained how this recipe worked earlier, so this is just the same but like on a larger scale. I get to work on this new material called ceramic powder, which needs silicon, graphite and boron, and has uses in many recipes, including circuits which I briefly mentioned earlier. You will notice I said boron and not boric acid, because we have to smelt the boric acid first, which gives us the pure boron. I wish I could show you when and where I was smelting the boron, but I literally cannot find it, so I can only assume it was more paused OBS shenanigans. Tier 2 sensors are up next, but they need titanium tetrachloride, and rather than run a pipe all the way from here to the mall, I opt to barrel it up and have bots ferry it over. I also put together a new explosive recipe by combining nitric acid, glycerin and a few solid ingredients to make good old nitroglycerin. Nitric acid is made using ammonia and oxygen. To make sensor 2s we need to use a nanofabricator, a new building you might have noticed me using for the circuits, which is used to craft things which need absolute precision. Sensor 2s gave us access to scout drones, which can be launched out of one of these drone launchers to scout faraway areas. Here's one in action. They're especially useful in this mod because the radars are really bad for exploring new areas, mostly only useful for keeping an eye on your existing base. I wait for a dozen or so to craft up, and then rain hell on the undiscovered world. You get a pretty good view of the entire map so far here, and you can see how much this new base absolutely dwarfs the old one. My next goal is getting all of the buildings ready for physics research, which basically just means expanding this mall massively, as buildings from all walks are required to craft it. It might seem expensive for a single craft of science, but it gives us 25 boxes of physics research, which makes 125 unboxed packs. We're going to talk more about boxing when we get around to fully utilising it, but in most cases, it's a flat 400% boost to the throughput for little cost. There are a lot of buildings and intermediates in Nullius, usually taking 3 or 4 ingredients each, which is why I never bothered with a belted mall, but even using bots the size of the mall grows quickly. I'll try to put up the crafting tree for tier 2 labs, although it was far too big for the website I used to show it well. A single ingredient of physics science this is, by the way. For the next few hours of footage are mostly me just expanding this mall, so we'll be skipping through a lot of it to the interesting bits. I eventually research a new tier of beacons and place them down out here to complete a research checkpoint. The small beacon 2 can take 2 modules and transmit its effect over a small area, and the large beacon 1 can take 1 module and transmit its effect over a large area, but cannot be in the range of another large beacon, and also reduces the effectiveness of small beacons in its range. Both of these are useful in their own way. I also put this tier 2 lab I was talking about earlier to use, since these tier 1 labs weren't actually able to keep up with the amount of science we were producing. For physics research, we're going to need Stirling Engine 2s, for which we need to make the tier 2 heat pipes and storage tanks, for which we need eutectic salt, requiring nitric acid, limestone and soda ash. This is a good time to further introduce boxing, as thermal tank 2s require boxed eutectic salt. Boxing is completely free in an assembler, only requiring an amount, usually about 20 of the item, and giving you 4 boxes of it, which might be used in recipes like this, or can be turned back into the ingredient elsewhere. In this case, the tank needs 3 boxes of the salt, which translates to 15 of the unboxed item. Despite physics research being quite far away, I still placed the assemblers down ready for it. Due to the density of boxed recipes, we only need 4 large assemblers to keep up with the 120 science per minute target I've been aiming for. Next to it, we set up solar power towers, which unlike their smaller cousins are an insane source of power. The gist is that the tower stands in the middle of a field of reflective heliostat mirrors, which focus the sun onto a single point, and then the heat from the pure beam of solar power can be extracted and used to generate power. Both the towers and the mirrors are a little bit expensive, but once placed, they produce a peak of 100 megawatts of power, and an average across an entire day cycle of 70 megawatts. I get started building one, but it'll be a while before I get the required 550 heliostat mirrors to fully utilise this tower. I also finished researching the Mechaling, a mini Spidertron which, in retrospect, really isn't that great, but has its uses. It's very slow and has quite a small inventory, but honestly, I just kept using it for the novelty. I recently unlocked a new process for voiding chlorine, which is a lot easier and more expandable than the old one, involving dissolving crushed limestone in hydrochloric acid to make calcium chloride, which I mentioned earlier, and which can be easily voided. I also recently got water fill, which just takes concrete, explosives and a lot of saline water, and allows me to place these shallow water pools wherever I want to void fluids anywhere. I ended up expanding it a lot further, as since I'd turned on all the science, the caustic solution tank had very slowly been draining due to backed up chlorine, and I needed to fill it back up as fast as possible, since until I do, barely any sodium hydroxide is getting out for use in chemical science. With physics science close at hand, I wanted to get started on my 4th base of the playthrough, this time making use of compressed gas and boxed items. The first thing I wanted to make was my pure water electrolysis, but I had seen that using steam electrolysis was a bit more energy efficient, so I decided to go with that. The thing about boiling water is that you need heat to do it, so I decided to lay down another solar tower to get the necessary heat. With this heat, I can then boil fresh water pumped out of the ground, and dump any of the wastewater produced out of the outfalls to the left. For both water and steam electrolysis, there is a pressurised and a non-pressurised version, so naturally we're going with the pressurised version for throughput, and also for the reason that it just magically gives you more hydrogen per input than the non-pressurised version, for some reason. You can tell that a gas is in its compressed form, as it has this more fluid drop shape rather than the gas mark shape it had earlier. I can then move on to the pressurised improved air separation build. By this point, I'm basically only using tier 2 buildings, as most of them I had to produce anyway for physics science. You'll also notice I'm using the new tier 3 pipes, which are made out of fiberglass and can carry 80% pressure rather than the 60% of the tier 2 pipes. The only problem with using pressurised air separation is that, to my knowledge, there is no way to create compressed air directly from the atmosphere, so we have to pass normal air through these compressors before it reaches the distilleries. I really don't know why they need to be so loud. The general structure for this base is going to be as follows. Trains will bring in any bulk materials such as iron ore, process them at scale making use of boxes the entire way, and then from there all solid materials will be moved around by bots, and any fluids will be moved onto a fluid bus. I'll talk more about this in the next part, but the stupidly long recipe chains in this mod mean that putting productivity modules into everything results in easily like 200% gains on some crafting chains. So although bots sound like they won't keep up, I believe with the combination of this and boxing, they will. This area you've just watched me fill in here is where the train's going to drop off materials for the base. Quickly, before I continue with the base, this is what a full solar tower field looks like. Pretty cool, right? For some absolutely lobotomite reason, I decided to put the train depot well out the way of my base. Rather than the hydrogen canisters I used to fuel the trains last time, I'm using batteries now, which only need an electrolyzer to refill them. However, it means that bots need to deliver top-up batteries all the way out here, which is, suffice to say, a massive waste of time. We also here have the debut of tier 2 trains. I get started on an iron mine connected to a train system and make use of these new boxer buildings, which are tiny, compact ways to box items quickly. You don't even need to pick the recipe, just drop in the items and it packs them. Despite being 5 times as dense in theory, boxes only allow you to fit twice as much ore in a train, as they only stack to 20, which is equivalent to 100 of the material itself. This is an issue that bots and belts don't suffer from. What we really want is limestone, however, for, as always, I need to get caustic solution set up before I can do anything else. Now that I have access to water fill, which I should say I did not choose to have, but was part of the mod pack, setting up anything to do with seawater is much easier. From there, it's just a simple caustic solution build like any of the other ones, except I'm boxing all of the excess sodium hydroxide to be taken elsewhere. To neutralise the chlorine, we're of course using limestone. We can talk about the new boxed recipes here, as instead of having to unbox the materials at their destination, the mod actually gives us some boxed versions of recipes, which work exactly the same as the unboxed version, just all of the ingredients and products are boxed, and it takes longer to make up for the increased throughput. In this case, when we crushed boxed limestone, we get boxed crushed limestone and boxed stone. To neutralise excess chlorine, we're using the calcium chloride recipe, which also has a boxed version, allowing us to input boxed crushed limestone. The amount of fluids is also increased by a factor of 5, so that the recipe is ratioed exactly the same as the normal recipe. Of course, when we crushed the limestone, we also created stone boxes, which we're disposing of using the old mineral dust method. With caustic solution now flowing, I can get started on iron. My target for the setup is a belt of boxed iron ingots, equal to 5 belts of unboxed ingots, although I can easily increase this later on by just dropping in next tier of buildings once I have them unlocked. Before I finished the setup, however, I realised I've forgotten to set up graphite, so I quickly go and do that. Boxed smelting recipes can only be done in these large furnaces, and thanks to their fast crafting speed, as well as the general efficiency of the boxed recipes, these 4 furnaces will give us a whole belt of boxed graphite. It does, however, need compressed methane rather than the regular stuff, but thankfully we've been given a recipe which turns compressed hydrogen and carbon dioxide directly into compressed methane. Whilst I was here, I realised that all this solar boiling business was more effort than it was worth, and wasn't giving me very good throughput, so I decided instead to just go with good old freshwater filtration. Back over at the iron smelting, I just had to plug the graphite, crushed limestone and crushed iron into this stack of large furnaces to get a steady belt of iron ingot boxes. If you were wondering what would happen if a recipe required uncompressed gas, but all I had was compressed gas, well, a barrel pump can be used to decompress the compressed gas, like in this lime recycling setup here. I got to work making some boxed iron components, but quickly realised I didn't have any lubricant for the wiring sheets. So I went to rectify that, but quickly realised I didn't have any silicon for the lubricant. Oops. Now of course, I need to go connect a sandstone patch to the rail network. The silicon build is just the same as last time, except obviously boxed and using the normal silica recipe rather than the daft one I used. I'm not going to bother belting it over to the lubricant, simply using robots to carry it over will suffice. And what do you know? We use the boxed lubricant recipe, which allows me to turn the silicon boxes directly into lubricant. With the lubricant, we can now finish this little component area and move on. The next natural step is to sort out aluminium, so I build northwest to an area where there is a bauxite patch and 2 fumarole fields right next to each other, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. I lay down the usual system to turn bauxite into alumina, but from here, the recipe diverges from what we are used to. Essentially, rather than smelting the alumina, we instead electrolyse it with eutectic salt to give us aluminum ingots and oxygen. We would, if I had the recipe anyway. As it turns out, I had blindly followed Factory Planner without realising I hadn't researched the recipe I was using, so now I need to wait like 5 hours before I can even turn it on. Only slightly shaken by this misstep, I move on to another important resource, plastic. We yet again have a new plastic recipe at our disposal, this time being cross-linked polyethylene, or PEX for short. Immediately seeing this recipe, it might seem a bit expensive, requiring silicon and aluminum powder, as well as a lot of ethylene and hydrogen chloride, before you realise that it gives 9 boxes of plastic per craft. 9. That's 45 plastic bars. Plus, getting rid of some more chlorine for free never hurt anybody. The only actual issue is due to me messing up the aluminum build, meaning that for now, we're going to have to import the aluminum from the old base to keep this going. I quickly threw together an alkene synthesis build, but it's not really worth talking about in detail, considering that I've done it twice before, and it's just the same now except with pressurised recipes. Originally, I wanted to finish this episode once I'd set up all of the basic materials in the new base, but I thought it might be a bit more interesting if I were to instead get started on something entirely new. Providing I haven't already changed my mind on the title, attention payers among you will know where this is going. I started here by producing glycerol, made by combining ECH, hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide. Combining glycerol and oxygen in a nanofabricator produces sugar, which is an important building block of life. This is a poor way of producing sugar, since it's basically implied the machine is fabricating sugar molecules individually, but it's meant to be, since we are literally bootstrapping life from scratch. Our goal right now is to start producing biochemistry research packs, which take the 4 pillars of life in this mod: sugar, amino acids, fatty acids and nucleotides, as well as some chemistry and electrical research for good measure. The biological research packs are not like a new tier of science pack, but instead like their own tech tree in parallel to the main one, and gated by certain technologies from the main tech tree. Amino acids are relatively simple, but incredibly slow to make, taking a combination of ammonia, oxygen and glycerol, but taking 8 seconds to produce a single unit. For reference, we need 1100 for a single biochemistry research pack, meaning it would take a single nanofabricator 7 hours and 20 minutes to make enough for the 3 packs required just for the first research. I only built 1 at this moment, but quickly realised many more will be needed. Methanol, oxygen and propene get us fatty acids, and although they are still very slow, they are the chemical I had the least problem with. Finally, sugar, methanol, nitric acid and amino acids give us nucleotides, the final chemical we need for biochemistry research. Biological research requires a new type of lab, the biology laboratory. It's a bit bigger than a normal lab and takes a lot more power, but most importantly of all, it gives us 4 module slots to fill up with productivity modules. Whilst waiting for the 3 biochemistry packs to craft, I get all of my ducks in order in the old base, including building a whole new solar tower field to make sure I stay ahead on power. Like I said earlier, I was immediately experiencing that the amino acid production was insufficient, so I expanded it out a bit further. After a long wait, I get the 3 biochemistry packs for the first biology research, which is going to allow us to create our first living thing once it finishes researching. Once it is researched, we can combine a canister, some chemical and physical science, and nucleotides to create a bacteria genome, the DNA of a small bacterial organism from which we can create living bacteria. To create the bacteria themselves, we first need to create protocells to put the DNA into. We then combine the genome, protocells and some of the biological chemicals to create living bacteria. Now, to start breeding these bacteria, we need to feed them cellulose, which is another material we need to make in a poorer way, but will unlock a much better biological way to create later. I made this solvent build, and by combining it with sugar in a nanofabricator, we get cellulose. Once we have produced enough bacteria from the genomes, breeding more is as simple as giving them seawater, sugar, cellulose, and mineral dust. A neat detail is that bacteria is actually a fluid, so we'll use an overflow valve to make sure there is always enough bacteria in the system to get put back into the process. You might notice in the top right corner that I'm already researching the next biology research. This new research gives us access to the algae genome, which, as the name suggests, is going to allow us to start producing algae. Using algae genomes, we can start producing algae progenitors, from which we can finally produce the algae itself. To create the algae from the progenitor, we provide it with mineral dust, seawater and air, and it reproduces into 2 new algae. Once we create enough algae this way, we will be able to breed them using the same ingredients. Algae can be crushed down into algae spores and cellulose, and by combining the algae spores with those same 3 ingredients as the progenitors, we get even more algae, which we can then crush down into more spores to make more algae to make more spores. You get the idea. You might have noticed the important detail there. Crushing the algae into spores also produces cellulose, meaning we now have a way to produce cellulose without having to use that terrible recipe from earlier, making it much easier to feed the bacteria. And it's a good job too, as the next tier of biological science, microbiology research, requires 200 bacteria, 100 algae and an algae progenitor. To find out what I'm going to unlock with it, however, and what I'm going to do with the rest of this base, I regret to say you're going to have to wait until next time. Thank you all for watching, and a special thanks to my Ko-Fi supporters: Dragonium, Zachachaquack, Acrid Arsonist, Arome, Dick Dastardly Enthusiast, Scovey, Watcher, Mockafet, Greenest God, Foxtrot 9000, Moon Runes, Thomas, Shrunk Hoovy, Dr. Ducklumps, Das Tom, Nathan 14321, Two Step SA, Leo, Zach, Promoron, The Fiendish, Justice, Michael Schoening, Hey1121, Whacked Dragon 3, and Ion Burger.